Good morning, Ollie at Berkeley, and welcome to our Friday special events. My name is Matt Shears. I'm the curriculum coordinator here at Ollie, and today we're happy to bring back Jon Haveman to talk about the Black-White Wealth Gap. This is another in our series, kind of our sub-series within our speaker series called America's Unfinished Work, and the specific focus of this addresses systemic inequities and the legacy of racism and colonialism in America. Jon is the executive director of the National Economic Education Delegation, also known as NEED, and he's an expert on economic policy. He holds a Ph.D. in economics from the University of Michigan. Jon, welcome back.
Thanks very much, Matt. It's good to be here. All right. Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for signing in this morning. Let me get my screen shared here. As Matt indicated, I will be talking about the Black-White Wealth Gap, which is significant and growing. Let me talk, before I get there, a little bit more about NEED. NEED is a nonprofit that I started back in about 2016 or 17, largely out of my dissatisfaction with politicians who, in my estimation, were using economics more as a weapon for their personal agenda rather than as a tool for social good. And I thought I'd rather they use it as a tool for social good. So I started thinking about why they can get away with using it as a weapon. It really occurred to me that the electorate doesn't know what it should about economic policy issues. And I know that sounds a little bit like an elitist condemnation of the electorate, but it's not. It's really a condemnation of the economics profession. We're the ones who know a ton about economic policy issues, and we just don't tell anybody. So NEED is my effort to get the economics profession out into the wild, giving talks such as this one on a wide variety of different topics in a very nonpartisan way. A very nonpartisan way that talks about, okay, here's the data on the issue, here's how economists think about the issue. Have gotten a fair amount of buy-in from the economics profession. We have an honorary board of 54 members, not the least of which are Janet Yellen and Ben Bernanke. We have 4 Nobel Prize winners, about 652 members of the delegation. These are sort of rank and file members of the academic economics community. All of them have a PhDs, and all of them help out in one way or another, either writing slide decks for us or actually giving presentations. And we have some global partners. These are largely economics friends of mine who live in other countries who think this is a good idea. I've got friends in the UK and in Italy who tell me, once you get things straightened out in the United States, Jon, come on over here because we've got the same problem. So the profession as a whole thinks this is important, and we have developed a slide decks on a bunch of different important policy issues. Here is a list of some of the most common on which we speak. Healthcare is very popular these days, as is immigration economics. But today we are here to talk about the Black-White Wealth Gap. I also want to put it out there to anybody. If you are a member of any group that brings in speakers, Rotary, Kiwani, retirement community, what have you, please reach out. I'd be delighted to set you up with a speaker on a topic of your interest. You're in the Bay Area, so the speaker will probably be me. And I hope that's a good thing. But at any rate, here are the topics of interest. The last slide of this slide deck will have my contact information, and I will send a link to these slides to Ollie when we're done, so that hopefully they can distribute that link to the rest of you. All right, so that's enough about NEED. Let's get into the Black-White Wealth Gap. This slide deck was authored by myself and Derek Hamilton. Derek Hamilton is at the New School in New York. All of the NEED slide decks are reviewed by a conservative subject matter expert and a liberal subject matter expert. And those two listed there, one of them is conservative, one is liberal. I won't identify them. But only the stuff that the material that they agree on actually makes it into the slide deck. I think there's a joke about how, okay, I am now done because economists can never agree with each other. But it turns out there really is a lot on which we agree. We agree on the data, we agree on how to think about it. Where economists usually differ is on policy solutions, and we'll talk about some of those at the end of this talk. All right, so what are we going to do? We're going to provide just a little bit of evidence on the disparities. We'll talk a little bit about why wealth is important. I think most of us understand fundamentally why it's important, but it's nice to sort of enumerate or elucidate the particular reasons why, from an individual and a society's perspective, a nice, relatively even distribution of wealth is a good idea. We'll talk about some of the sources of disparities and the implications of disparities, and then we will dig into policy solutions. If you do have questions, again, please put them in the chat. I will endeavor to look for them there. If I miss one, hopefully Matt will interrupt me. There should be time at the end of the talk. I'm hoping 10 or 15 minutes for verbal Q&A. So please do hold on to any questions that you might have if you don't feel like putting them in the chat. Okay, so let's dig in. First, let's put everybody on the same page when I talk about wealth. When I talk about wealth, I really mean net worth. That is assets minus liabilities. Now, probably in this talk, I will end up referring both to wealth and to net worth. I apologize for that, but sometimes I can't help it. And I mean the same thing, whether I say wealth or net worth. The assets included in the vast majority of these statistics are pretty comprehensive: owned homes, cars, stocks, businesses, savings and checking accounts, pensions, life insurance, what have you. The debts include home mortgage, car loans, credits, any other significant financial obligations, right? So it's very, very comprehensive analysis of assets and liabilities. Okay, so let's take a look at what's happened to wealth in the United States over time. This graph shows you what's happened to wealth between 1989 and 2019. These are in inflation-adjusted dollars. So the growth that you see in the top line there is real. Wealth in the United States has increased from about $35 trillion up to more than $100 trillion over the course of that, 30-year period. You can see that not only was there tremendous growth, but the vast majority of that growth went to the top. People in the top 10% of the wealth distribution, that's that lightest area up at the top, their wealth increased by about 240%. The next 40 percentiles, between the 51st and 90th percentile, their wealth increased by 137%, right? That's that sort of brown area. And then the dark area down there, that sliver down at the bottom, that's the bottom 50% of households in the United States. That's the wealth that the bottom 50%, half of households in the United States account for that much wealth. Now, their wealth did increase between 1989 and 2019, but only by about 65%. So 240% at the top, 137% in the bottom of the top half, if you will, and 65% down at the bottom. So tremendous growth, but not by any stretch evenly distributed. I find this is kind of a nice perspective, a nice backdrop to have for thinking about the black-white wealth gap. Another way to look at it, and I find this image kind of sears into people's brains a little bit, that if we take land mass of the United States and we spread it out in the same way that total wealth is spread out, 1% would own everything in that upper left-hand quadrant. The next 9% would own everything in that upper right-hand quadrant, and the remaining 90% of households in the United States would own that sliver down at the bottom. And so that gives you a sense, a sort of tangible sense as to just how unevenly wealth is distributed in the United States. Okay, with that as a backdrop, let's turn to the black-white wealth gap. All right, here's evidence directly on the black-white wealth gap. As of 2022, mean wealth, average wealth in white households, that's that big navy blue bar on the left, mean wealth in white households was $1.4 million. The maroon bars, and throughout the presentations, I try to be consistent. The blue bars are for white and the maroon bars are for black, but mean average black wealth in 2022 was just $211,000. We look at the median, and I put both up because a lot of people prefer the median when thinking about it. The median, for those of you that don't have a lot of statistics, and there's no reason you should know what the median is, but that is the household right in the middle. So if we take all of the black households and we line them up from the lowest wealth to the highest wealth households, then we pick the one in the middle, that's the median value. So for black households, that's about $45,000 in 2022. And for white households, it's about $285,000. We can look at the ratio. When we look at the mean, the ratio is about 6.5. So white wealth is 6.5 times greater than black wealth. And it's about the same when we look at the median. it's about 6.3 times greater. So a little bit less disparity when you look at median than the mean, but the number for the median for Black households is so low, it's really disconcerting. That means that half of Black households have net worth less than $45,000. We can take a look at this gap over time. Let's focus on the median. The navy blue line up here is median white wealth, and the red line, the maroon line down here is median Black wealth. You can see that ratio has fluctuated over time. It went all the way up to almost 11 back in 2013, and it's come back down. Right, it's come back down not because the absolute gap between Black and white wealth is coming down. You can see that that gap is really very, very high. It's coming down because we are getting growth in the level, the median of Black net worth. Right, so it's increased significantly through the pandemic, but by not nearly as much as white net worth has. So it's a problem that rather disconcertingly is not getting that much better over time. The ratio is coming down, but the absolute gap continues to grow. Let's look at just a couple of explanations for why there might be a gap, right? Well, I think it's reasonably well known that the distribution of income for Black and white households is very different, right? And this gets at that just a little bit. If you look over here at where it says first, those two bars, that's the share of Black and white households that are in the bottom quintile of the income distribution. That is, that's the 20% of households in the United States that have the lowest income. And you see that about 18% of white households are in that group, and 33% of Black households are in that group. So Black households are really dramatically overrepresented down at the bottom of the income distribution. And it stands to reason that if you have less income, your ability, your capacity to generate wealth is going to be lower. And that certainly is true, but it turns out that that really has very little to do with the gap. Now, when I say that, what do I mean by that? If we look at the distribution, right, here again, we have the bottom 20%. If we look at the distribution of income and the wealth at those different parts of the income distribution, we see that there is still a very significant gap. If we look just at the bottom 20%, right? Median net worth for white households in the bottom 20% is 10,000. For Black households, it is 0. Right? That means that everybody in the 20%, bottom 20% of the income distribution for Black households has no net worth and perhaps even significantly negative net worth. If we go up to the next percentile, the 20 to 39th, the next quintile, the 20 to 40th percentile, we see there remains a gap. And we continue we're going from left to right up the income distribution, we see that the gap continues and the gap widens, right? So out here, if we look at the top 10%, Black households in the top 10% of the income distribution have net worth of about $335,000, and white households in the top 10% of the income distribution have net worth of about $1.8 million. So that gap again is about 6. All right, so income is not what's driving the wealth gap. At all levels of income, there is a very significant gap in the wealth between white and Black households. All right, so we can look at age. Right? If we look at age, this is the lime green line up here is median net worth for white households at the different points in the age distribution, and the darker line is for Black. Right, you can see down here at the bottom in the age 18 to 34 age category, we know everybody has very much wealth, but still white households have more wealth than Black households down at the bottom. And that gap continues to grow. Continues to grow until we get into the mid to late 50s. And then there's a pretty solid, pretty stable gap in wealth between white and Black households, but it is very large. Now you can see that gap grows with age. Right, so it's not age is not an issue, and income is not an issue. Okay, so it is not the explanation. So we'll go through a bunch of other different potential explanations. But first, let's talk about why wealth is important. Why do we care if there's a Black-white wealth gap? Well, I think that we all know fundamentally why we care, but let's talk about it a little bit more specifically. So there are 2 reasons that we care. We care at the individual or household level, and we care because it matters for broader society. right? So at the individual or household level, it gives people choices, gives them agency over their lives, if you will. It's also true that wealth is iterative. Okay, so a little bit more on what I mean by those things. Well, in terms of choices or life agency, there are any number of decisions that you have access to if you have access to wealth, right? If you don't have access to wealth, getting higher education is going to be more challenging. Living in good neighborhoods is going to be harder. Saving for retirement will be harder. Capital to start a business, and we'll talk more about entrepreneurship later, or the ability to withstand financial hardship. Here's a statistic that I'll put out there. It's not relevant to black and white, but it turns out that in the United States, this was pre-pandemic. I don't know what the number is now, but pre-pandemic, it turns out that 40% of all households, 40%, 2 in 5, 40% of all households did not have enough access to cash to withstand a $400 financial emergency. A $400 financial emergency. That number is kind of staggering. It's staggeringly high in terms of the percentage of households that don't have access to even that small amount of liquid assets. Like back to this, if you don't have wealth, if you run afoul of the legal system, you're going to have a hard time getting good legal counsel. You're not going to be able to exert political influence, and it's going to be difficult to finance costly medical procedures, right? And if we look at healthcare between black and white households, it's reflected, the wealth gap is reflected there. Black households do not get access to the same medical care that white households do. And, this is more a nice thing. You're not going to be able to leave bequests to your kids. Very important for your kids. Wealth is iterative. What do I mean by saying that wealth is iterative? What I really mean when I say that wealth is iterative is that wealth begets more wealth. If you have some, it's very easy to get more. If you don't have any, it's very hard to get some, right? An example, right? I guarantee you that Elon Musk, Warren Buffett, and Jeff Bezos, they have access to investments. They have access to low interest loans that you and well, I don't know about everybody out there, but I'm guessing that you and I do not have access to. And that's because of their great wealth, right? I'm guessing that most of us have significant wealth, but still, we don't have the access that they do. And if you have no wealth, you don't have access to even what you and I have access to. Wealth transfers across generations. We'll talk a little bit about how wealth is very sticky. If you're born into a low wealth household, and then as an adult, you're more likely to have a low wealth household. If you're born into a high wealth household, you're more likely to end up as an adult in a high wealth household. So wealth mobility is pretty low in the United States. And since so many Black children are born and raised in households with very little wealth, they're going to struggle to amass wealth. Right. So again, why is parental wealth important? Important for pre-estates transfer effects on kids. That's before you die and you bequeath some money to them, right? Your wealth as a parent is going to affect probably their human capital accumulation. If you have great wealth, fine, head off to an Ivy League school, no problem. If you don't, then the question of going to school may be significant in its own right. So it influences even the returns to education, whether your child goes off to Dartmouth or goes to the community college, right? That determines what kind of contacts they're going to have later on in life and how much benefit they're going to get. And the adult incomes of offspring, as I mentioned, we'll talk in a minute about how wealth and income are both very sticky in the United States. It's also clear that nurture plays a big role. And I think this is important because there's nothing fundamental about being Black that means that you're going to struggle to accumulate wealth, right? What matters much, much more is the environment in which you grow up. And if you grow up in low wealth, you're going to be low wealth more than likely. If you grow up in high wealth, you're going to be high wealth as an adult more than likely. There are studies that people have done on twins that were separated from birth, and you look at differences in the wealth of the households where they end up, and they're separated. They end up in different houses, and it turns out that the wealth of the household that you grow in matters an awful lot for later outcomes. So here's how I and many economists think about whether or not wealth is sticky in the United States. If wealth were not at all sticky, then we would have a transition matrix that looks like this. And I call it a transition matrix, and that sounds really super complicated, but it's not. It's reasonably simple. Down here on the horizontal axis, we have parental wealth. Right? This one means that your parents are in the lowest quintile of the wealth distribution. They're in the lowest wealth, 20% of American households. And over here in the 5, then they're in the 20% of the highest wealth households in the United States. Right. And if wealth was not at all sticky, then if you're born down here, then you have an equal chance of being up here on the vertical axis, that's own or adult wealth outcomes. Right. If you're born into the lowest quintile, you're equally likely to end up in any of the quintiles. And the same thing if you're born into a high quintile household. Right. But it turns out that's not close to the real data. Here's what the real data say. Right, if you're born into a low wealth household, your chances are 40% or double what it was if it was random, double likely that you're going to end up as a low wealth adult, and only 7% chance that you're going to be a high wealth adult. And similarly, in reversed, if you're born into a high wealth household, your odds of being in a high wealth household as an adult are double, and less than half if there's the likelihood of ending up in a low wealth household, right? Even at the middle, right, there is some stickiness. Right? You're more likely to end up in the middle than you are the top or the bottom. Right? And a lot of people look at this and say, well, wealth's not all that sticky. That's, I guess, a matter of interpretation. This to me suggests a significant amount of stickiness. Okay, let's turn to tangible benefits for the broader economy, right? If wealth is more evenly distributed, we get more human capital development, we get increased entrepreneurship. Again, more on that in a minute. We get a healthier labor force because more people are getting the health care that they need. So less social unrest, less reliance on social programs, and in fact, we would have a smaller stock of student loans. I may have, if Biden keeps working at student loans the rate that he is, I may have to delete that final bullet, which would be nice. All right, so wealth is important individuals for societies. Let's talk about some important sources of the disparities. On this page, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about this. I have another talk where I go into these in detail, and I can go on for a couple of hours, but we're going to give it a relatively short shrift. But I think I'm going to give it enough time, so I'm hoping that you get a real sense for the origin of the black-white wealth gap. Right? If you really think about our policy history, it has played an enormous role in the black-white wealth gap. Right? And it starts off with the slave trade. I call that the first deprivation of wealth, right? Why? Because you kidnap a slave in Africa, you bring them to the United States. Well, in Africa, they probably had some form of wealth. Whether that wealth was even just community, or that wealth was land, that wealth was whatever it was, you don't have it anymore. So that's the first great deprivation. Slavery is not really deprivation, other than slaves were deprived of the opportunity to even learn how to accumulate wealth, let alone accumulate wealth. And then there is the 40 acres and the mule and a mule in the wake of the Civil War. I call this the second deprivation because they only had access to the 40 acres for a few months. 40 acres and a mule was a policy under Lincoln. John Wilkes Booth would have been very happy about this, but when Lincoln was shot and killed, then Andrew Johnson became president. Andrew Johnson was not so much a fan of the 40 acres, so he took the 40 acres back and he gave it back to the former slaveholders. Now, I don't know about you, but when I was in school, we learned about 40 acres and a mule. I did not learn that they had to give the land back. So think of this as the second deprivation. Then there's the Freedmen's Bank. And this was a bank that was set up in the wake of the Civil War. It was meant to be very, very safe, where freed slaves could put their savings and it would be safe. Well, it was, of course, safe until rich white bankers saw that there was a lot of money in there, and they thought, well, we can do a whole lot better for these folks. And so they invested a lot of it in railroads. Well, there was a railroad bubble at the time, and the bubble burst, and about 50% of the savings in the Freedmen's Bank went poof. So lax oversight and dissolution of that. The Jim Crow laws and economic policies during most of the last century made it very difficult for freed slaves and Black individuals to accumulate wealth. Then there were policies like the Homestead Act, which is not on its face discriminatory, and I don't think it was even intended to be discriminatory. But in order to take advantage of Homestead Act, you needed to have two things that many, many Black individuals and families did not have. One, you needed to have the capacity to navigate a bureaucracy, right? And if you've been enslaved for most of your life, you won't have that skill. You also need resources. You need resources to go out west and to live on and improve that land for 5 years. right? So it was not in intent, but in effect, very discriminatory. And the amount of land that was given out during the homesteading was enormous, equivalent almost to the combination of California and Texas. Then over the course of, between the Civil War and, well, I'm not sure when it ended per se, but there was so much land theft and destruction. The biggest example of that was Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. There was a whole neighborhood in Tulsa that was Black, that was very successful, and ultimately the white parts of Tulsa couldn't tolerate it, so they took it down, burned it down, and took and destroyed an enormous amount of Black wealth. The GI Bill. I would like to say the GI Bill was not intentionally discriminatory, but it was so discriminatory that it's hard to say that. The GI Bill consisted of access to education, access to housing, and access to unemployment insurance. But on all three fronts, it turned out to be very discriminatory. Levittown was built to accommodate returning vets, but it was built for returning white vets. In terms of education, returning white vets would go to state schools, which received additional funding to account for the increased enrollment, and Black vets were pushed towards historically Black colleges and universities, and towards vocational training. Right, and HBCUs were not given resources to accommodate the growth, so there was a deterioration in the quality of education at those schools during the GI Bill years, because very, very hard to accommodate a dramatic increase in enrollment. Federal Housing Authority, we could go on at length about redlining and the toll that it has taken. And again, this could be a 2-hour talk on just this slide. So I'll leave it there. I really think of, all of this combined explains the Black-white wealth gap. And why isn't it getting smaller? Now that, we've taken care of most of these problems, they're in the past. Well, because the people that you're running a race against, they're already well ahead of you. And catching up means that you have to run faster than them. And the notion that Black households with less wealth are going to be able to run faster than white households with more wealth, it's ridiculous. It doesn't work that way. Okay. So the results of all those policies for Black families, much lower accumulation of wealth than among white families. The implications, we've got less financial contribution from parents to children, more difficult access to higher education for the kids, and less access to capital for business formation. Black households are more likely to live in disadvantaged neighborhoods, have fewer role models, have less access to quality education, and leads to significant disparities in capacity. By capacity, I mean the availability of resources to build wealth between Black and white households, right? So the implications of all of those policies and that history are very significant. Excuse me for just a second. Okay, so those policies, and then the bottom line here is the disparities in the capacity. And by capacity, I don't mean anything innate. I mean the availability of resources with which to build wealth. At the end of the day, a huge disparity between Black and white families. There are lots of other explanations in what I'll call the common narrative. Differences in educational attainment, home ownership, savings. If only Black households would do things at the same rate that white households do in terms of financial literacy or entrepreneurship, then we could close the Black-white wealth gap. I mean, again, you're trying to catch up to somebody, so you're going to have to run faster. And if Black households don't do things at the same rate that white households do, but start to, they're not going to catch up. The gap will persist. Let's look at a bunch of these individually. Let's look at educational attainment. First, here are differences in the level of educational attainment between Black and white individuals. The first bar over here on the left is all racial and ethnic groups. About 33% of them have a bachelor's degree. If you looked at just Black or African American groups, it's about 25% of them that have a bachelor's degree. Amongst white individuals, it's 36%. So there's about an 11 percentage point difference in educational attainment between Black and white individuals. And as you might guess, right, this difference in educational attainment matters for income and matters for wealth distribution. Let's take a look at the extent to which it matters. right? So the blue bars here, that's for white individuals, households, and the red bars over here, that's for Black households. And we can look at median net worth by level of education. So down here, we've got white households with less than a high school education. Their median net worth is about $83,000. And up here, for those with post-college degree, it's about $500,000. And so you can see that education matters. It also matters for Black households, but it matters less. And if you look at Black households with less than a high school diploma, their median net worth is about $3,000. Black households with a post-college degree, it's $141,000. So it matters. Net worth goes up with educational attainment, but it doesn't go up nearly as fast or as much as it does for white households. And what's really, really startling about this image is that if you compare median net worth for Black households where the head of household has a college degree with white households where the head of household has less than a high school degree, right? It's lower for the Black household than the white household, and that's rather startling. So education matters, but even if Black individuals were to obtain the same level of education as white individuals at the same rate as white individuals do, there would still be a significant Black-white wealth gap. Let's talk a little bit about home ownership. So the yellow line up here at the top, that's the rate of home ownership amongst white households in the United States. If we look down here at the bottom, this maroon line is the rate of home ownership among Black households in the United States, right? It's much, much lower. It's about 40% lower for Black households than it is for white households. 30 percentage points, about 40% lower, right? So home ownership, it's often heralded, home ownership is as the pathway to wealth, right? And people have bought into that. We have much higher home ownership rates in the United States than in many countries. But there remains this enormous gap between Black and white households. Let's talk a little bit about the implications of that, right? So first, renters, median net worth among renters is about $5,200. Among owners, it's about $250,000. If we look at mean net worth, there's still a huge gap, right? If we look at Black and white households separately, right? Again, on the left, the blue, that's what happens when Black household difference in net worth for Black households, right? Black households that, I'm sorry, white households that own their home have median net worth about 239,000, and white households that don't, median net worth about 4,000. It matters for Black households, but again, not nearly as much as it does for white households. Right. So let's talk a little bit about why that is. Right. Let's talk about wealth equality through home ownership. Well, there's a big problem in that there is very well documented evidence of historical and ongoing housing and lending discrimination at the appraisal level, the buyer level, local laws, covenants. Two notes on this. One is that I'm in San Rafael, and just down the street from me, the friends of a friend of mine, a Black couple went to sell their house. So they did what everybody does. They went on to Zillow, and Zillow said, your house is worth about $1.5 million. And they said, okay, great, we're going to get a $1.5 million. Then they called in an appraiser, and the appraiser came in and appraised it at $1 million. Right? And they knew that that was not right. So they thought about it and they tried to figure out what the problem was. And they decided that the problem was probably that they're Black. So what they did was they whitewashed the house. They took out any evidence that a Black couple lived there. They had some white friends greet another appraiser. And lo and behold, the house appraised at $1.5 million. All right. They instigated a lawsuit. I think it was a significant class action lawsuit that was settled not long ago. But it is significant evidence that there remains ongoing discrimination in home buying markets and selling markets, starting at the appraisal level. Right, and it's all throughout. The second note is that there are covenants and zoning matters. Right, zoning, single-family zoning was originally put in place to discriminate. Right, it requires more money to buy a home in a neighborhood that's zoned for single-family homes rather than is zoned for multi-family housing. Right, and so it was just designed to discriminate both by income status and by race. I'll put it out there. I'll ask you all to think about it. Does anybody know where single family zoning first started? And it turns out it first started in Berkeley, California, which I found very, very startling when I learned that. I learned that from, I don't remember the name of the author, but there is, it's The Color of Law, which is a really, really good book that I highly recommend. It's largely about discrimination in housing in the San Francisco Bay Area, but it applies more broadly than just the Bay Area. Okay, so what about home prices in minority neighborhoods? Is it as good an investment for a Black household to buy their home as it is for a white household? It turns out that home values are about 50% lower in majority Black neighborhoods. If you look at an identical home, 3 bedroom, 2 bath, remodeled kitchen, and you look at an identical home, there's a 50% difference in the home value. If you adjust for quality and amenities, right, then the Black house is 23% lower in value. And it turns out that appreciation rates tend to be lower in Black neighborhoods than they do in white neighborhoods. Right. So what determines differences in home ownership? Important differences: the wealth of the parents, ability to borrow. Right? There's lots of lending discrimination out there. Local ordinances. There's lots of housing discrimination out there. And the lower appreciation rates of homes in majority Black communities, it simply makes it less appealing as an investment. And because of all of those things, we get differences in the rate of home ownership and a Black-white wealth gap that continues to grow. Increases in savings. It turns out if you look overall, Black households save less money than do white households. But if you account for household income, if you compare apples to apples, low-income Black households, in fact, save more than do low-income white households, right? So the savings issue, it's a non-issue. If you look at the risk and reward, well, it turns out that white investors get higher rewards for taking on more risk. But again, if you control for income, it's not at all clear that that's true. And the access to and tolerance for higher risk investments, right? Can you stand to lose the money, right? If you're lower income, you can't. If you're higher income, you can. Financial literacy, right? So a lot of this is about using payday lenders, right? But it's also true that if you just look at Black households versus white households, Black households tend to invest in things that have lower rates of return, lower rates of asset appreciation. But if you control for income, there's no difference, right? Low income households invest in assets that have lower rates of appreciation than do high income households. And that explains any differences that you see in the aggregate numbers between Black and white households. I see there are several questions in the chat. Well, so JB, we'll talk a little bit about the solutions. Yeah, The Color of Law, I'm glad you read it. It's a terrific book. Richard Rothstein, thank you, Catherine. Oh, I didn't know that Richard Rothstein just wrote a follow-up book. I'll have to have a look at it. Okay, thanks everybody. Right. So keeping on with financial literacy a little bit, right? So part of the reason people say, oh, there are big differences in financial literacy is because they look at this data. All right, and this data, what is this telling us? The maroon bar here, that's for Black households. That's telling us that Black households use payday lenders about 34% more often than do white households. Right, so Black households are much more likely to use payday lenders than are white. And you and I probably all know that using a payday lender is a really, really bad idea. It's a very bad from a financial perspective. They're going to end up taking a lot of your money. Turns out if we control for income and if we control for other things, race, demographics, and financial, over here on the right-hand side, you see that Black households are only 4.4% more likely to use payday lenders than are white, and it's not statistically significant. So there is no difference once you control for income. So the whole financial literacy issue, throw it out. Entrepreneurship, this shows you rates of new entrepreneurs, the number of new entrepreneurs per 100,000 adults each month. The red line down here is for Black households. The blue line here is for white households. And the yellow line up here is for the Latino community. Much more entrepreneurship in the Latino community. More on that in just a second. Why do these rates of entrepreneurship differ so much? Well, first, there are enormous disparities in the access to capital. The wealth disparities, you can't go to the bank of mom and dad as much, and you don't have the wealth that an equivalent white household would have. It turns out that Black entrepreneurs are less likely to rely on banks for loans because it's going to be harder to get them and they're going to be at higher interest rates, and they're more likely to rely on credit cards. Well, credit cards have very high rates of interest, which puts the entrepreneurial venture in some jeopardy right from the get-go. And again, loans, if they get loans, they're going to have higher interest rates, less access to venture funds. It turns out that people like to lend money to the people who look like them. And this is a problem for Black entrepreneurs. It's also a problem for female entrepreneurs. Again, it goes back to education. The higher your level of education, the more likely you are to be an entrepreneur. And previous business ownership in the family. If you know an entrepreneur, if your father or mother was an entrepreneur, if your aunt or uncle was an entrepreneur, you're more likely to be an entrepreneur. And for historical reasons, it's less likely that people in the Black community will have somebody in their direct family who was an entrepreneur. That also explains the high rate of entrepreneurship in the Latino community, right? Simply the act of moving from your home country to a new country is an act of entrepreneurship, right? And different stocks of relevant social capital. It's just harder given the circumstances of Black individuals relative to white. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but there's this whole notion about soft skills and how Black workers don't have them, right? On the left-hand side, right? They're just not as employable. They don't show up on time. They don't make eye contact with customers. They don't dress well. They don't have collaborative skills. All of that is just plain and simply racist, and it is not borne out in the data. Black workers are crowded into service sector jobs, right? Service sector jobs involve a lot of contact with the customer. And if you can't show up on time, you can't make eye contact, dress well, or have collaborative skills, you're not going to be put in a position where you interact with the customer. So they're well represented in service, sales, office, production, transportation, material moving, less well represented in jobs that are not customer facing. So let's just dispense with that one. There is a significant gap in Black-white earnings, even if we control for education, right? The blue bar here says that men with a high school diploma make 20% less than do Black men with a high school diploma make 20% less than do white men with a high school diploma. Over time, this is roughly the 80s, this is roughly the 90s, and the black bar is roughly the 2000s. Over time, that gap has been growing. Right? We'd like to think that in the wake of the civil rights era, that gap will be closing, but it's not. And that gap is growing even more for Black workers Black male workers with a bachelor's degree over time. It's growing for women with a high school diploma, and it's growing for women with a bachelor's degree. So the gap in Black-white earnings continues to grow, which puts a strain on the Black-white wealth gap. But again, income is not determinative of wealth. This graph shows you what happened to wealth for high-income white individuals between 1984 and 2007, right? Significant growth in that wealth. The darker blue line, middle-income white households, it's less, but still growth. And for middle and high-income and middle-income African-American households, right? So high-income African-American households, same income as high-income whites, but very, very different wealth story. Incarceration matters a lot, right? It's not a stretch. It's not too hard to imagine that if you've been incarcerated for a crime, you're going to have a harder time getting work when you come out. You're going to have a harder time accumulating wealth. Simply looking at the rates of incarceration in the United States in 2010, for Black individuals, it was 2,300 out of every 100,000 in population. For white individuals, just 450, right? So less than 1/4. The rates of incarceration differ significantly across race, and that makes it harder to close the gap. In California, our rate of incarceration is pretty high, but it's low by national standards. It's very high by international standards. In the United States, we lock up 698 out of every 100,000 in population, California 581, the next highest country, the UK, at 139. Right. So we like to incarcerate people. That is our response to crime. I mentioned at the outset differences in, it might be household status, right? We know that the household composition in the Black community is different from the white community. Does that matter for the gap? Well, even if we compare comparable demographic white and Black households, there remains a gap. So I've highlighted here Black and white households where they're married, both parents are present, and they have a bachelor's degree. You can see there's still a significant difference in wealth between Black and white households, right? So family structure doesn't play a role, except it plays a role cross-generationally, right? It turns out that again, blue is white and maroon is Black, right? Kids growing up in Black families, 53% of them, half of them are growing up in a household with only mom, and that's only 20% for white kids, right? And you know that if it's a mother only versus a both parent household, there's going to be a lower accumulation for wealth, and that is going to have implications for the child when they're an adult. It's going to be harder for Black kids. They're starting behind the starting line relative to white kids. Again, just the reminder that wealth is pretty sticky. Right. So what's fundamentally responsible? I'd like to be able to say that it's 5% individual behaviors, 40% structural characteristics, and what's left 55% history, policy, and otherwise, but we really don't have the data or the tools to be able to tease that out. What I can say is that working hard isn't enough to close the racial gap. Whether you work full-time or part-time, there's an enormous gap in wealth. Income doesn't explain it. We talked about this earlier. Wherever you are on the income distribution, if you're a Black household and comparing your wealth to white households, your wealth is likely to be lower. And studying hard is not enough, right? Whites who dropped out of high school have greater wealth than Blacks with a college degree, right? So all of these would help, but even if we equalize all of these things, then we will not equalize the Black and white wealth. There are those who have really tried to tease out, okay, what part of that is responsible for how much? And what we learned is that the number of years of home ownership matters. That's responsible for more than a quarter of the gap. Differences in home ownership, differences in household income, that's another fifth. Differences in spells of unemployment matter, about 10%. College education matters, and financial support and inheritance also matters. So then there's about 30% of the gap that's left unaccounted for. We just don't know how to explain it. We can't do it with observable variables. And that probably is a lot of that. And a lot of these, the difference in the numbers of years of home ownership due to different structural differences in society. So add that 30%, it's probably more than 30% that's due to structural racism throughout society. Okay, people were asking about solutions. So let's talk about some policy options. We could, this is again where we could spend an enormous amount of time talking about policy options because there are disparities throughout the economy that exacerbate the Black-white wealth gap. But let's focus in on income support and stability and asset accumulation. If we think about policies that are, broad-based or global solutions that aren't trying to directly address Black wealth versus white wealth, there are a bunch of suggestions out there. One is child trust accounts. You may have heard of them as baby bonds, and that's basically when you're born, maybe $10,000 or $20,000 is put into an account, and it's allowed to grow until you reach age 18. And at age 18, you can pull money out to get education, to start a business, to get healthcare. You have a stock of wealth when you turn 18. Or there's guaranteed minimum income. This is like universal basic income, only Elon Musk wouldn't get it. If your income is below a certain threshold, then this program would top up your income. So that would help provide more incomes to low wealth households, and hopefully that would spill over to better outcomes for the kids. Then there are just a ton of policies out there for addressing racial disparities directly. I'm going to bring up reparations, and I'm going to emphasize that reparations doesn't have to be money. Reparations could be aggressive affirmative action. Right? I know we're going in the opposite direction, and there's lots of evidence out there that affirmative action does work. So if we did it more aggressively, that would help. A new Homestead Act. The government still owns a ton of very productive land. We could have a Homestead Act for Black people. We had one for white. Why not have one for Black? We could heavily invest in Black communities, right? So the access to resource disparities wouldn't be as great. We could simply do differential tax treatment. It turns out that our current tax code, again, that's a long conversation, our current tax code discriminates against Black households. Why? Because Black households are more likely to be two workers with comparable incomes, and white households are more likely to be one worker with high income and one worker with none. And it turns out that there is a marriage penalty in that circumstance. We could change things like that. Labor laws and other laws that address discrimination, there is so much more that we could be doing on that front that we're not. And then I want to talk a little bit about the asset building agenda in the United States. Turns out we have an asset, the federal government spends about $400 billion a year encouraging people to build assets, right? So how does it do that? And what do I mean by that? I mean a bunch of tax deductions, right? So the one that first comes to mind is the mortgage interest deduction, right? That is designed to help people buy a house and help people accumulate wealth. Well, who primarily gets it? So this bar here shows us by income level what households get it, right? And not a huge surprise that the vast majority of the people who get that benefit are in the top 20% of the income distribution. Same with state and local property tax deduction. Same with employer-sponsored retirement plans. We spend about $200 billion a year on tax deductions for employer-sponsored retirement plans, and it turns out that the vast majority of that goes to households in the top of the income distribution, individual retirement accounts as well. Right. So my proposal is that we take these $400 billion and we actually divvy it out to people who need help developing assets. These people up here in the top 20%, they don't need help building assets. These people down here in the bottom 20%, they do. Right? And as we showed at the outset, Black families are disproportionately represented in the bottom 20% of the household, of the income distribution. Other concrete policies, we got limit the mortgage interest tax deduction, use the revenues to provide credit for first-time home buyers, automatic savings and retirement plans, right? I have about 6 different retirement plans because I had 6 different employers. You know, if the retirement plan was tied to the individual rather than to the employer, that would probably help. And then we could establish policies to supplement those. Reduce reliance on student loans while supporting success in post-secondary education. Universal children's savings accounts we talked about. Reform the safety net. It turns out that in order to access the safety net in the United States, you can't have assets. So you've got to be in a position of hardship for long enough to have run through your assets before you can get access to the safety net. And then when you come out on the other side, you're in a more financially precarious position than you were going in. That's a problem. We need to provide, we could provide subsidies to promote emergency savings, such as those linked to tax time. Let me sum up, and then I'm happy to stick around and take questions for as long as you all might have them. The Black-white wealth gap is enormous. In 2022, that's the latest data, white wealth was about 6.5 times more than Black wealth, both on average and at the median. There are lots of explanations in the common narrative. Most of them don't stand up to scrutiny. Remember, go back to home ownership, right? It would help if more Black households owned their home, but it would not close the gap. And there are a wide variety of reasons why Black households are less likely to own their home than white households. Going back in time, government policies have contributed enormously to this gap. Government policies created this gap in the first place. Racial dehumanizing permitted these policies. Wealth endowments, your parental wealth, is enormously important for determining your own wealth in adulthood. They're likely to be effective, right? And bottom line is that the Black-white wealth gap is not going to close itself on its own. It will not organically close itself. So we're going to need some form of policy intervention to close the gap. We had policy interventions that created the gap. We're probably going to need policy interventions to close the gap. Okay, that's all I have. Here again is my contact information. Again, I will send a link to my slides to the folks at Ollie there who will hopefully send it out to all of you. And now I'm going to stop sharing. I'll take a look at the chat. I apologize, I've been ignoring it. But if others of you have questions, please go ahead and hit the raise your hand button in Zoom. Okay. Let's see. Remove the spotlight on me. I should be able to see all of you now. Let me go back to the chat. Let's see. Thank you, Bob. The thought-provoking editorial in the New York Times on how property tax policies harm Black property owners. Yeah, there are a wide variety of ways in which tax laws and property tax policies. I'm going to have to go look at that because I'm not particularly familiar with it. Thanks for sharing the link. Let's see. After the black slaves were freed, were there any scouts kind of profession to go to China to buy Chinese laborers? I'm sorry, Julianne, I'm not sure what that question is asking. Um, Anybody else have any questions? Please go ahead and raise your hand if you do. I apologize. That was a little bit of a fire hose, but I did pare down the material to get it within an hour. There is an awful lot to talk about with regard to this topic, and an awful lot that people who are in a position to try to bring about change, a lot that they are just simply not aware of, and so that's part of the motivation by need for bringing up this as an important issue to talk about. Sean, yes, please go ahead and unmute and
There we go. Now I can unmute. Thank you for your the presentation today. Very insightful. A question I have is, have there been some studies on Black households that actually are wealthy or who have been able to sort of um, break through some of, go against some of the trends that you discussed, and how are they doing and sort of how that goes? Because I guess the question I'm getting at is, can you use folks that have been able to rise through the wealth gap to isolate other causal effects,
Sure. I don't know that there are studies that look at their experience and how are they able to do it. It's identifying why it is that Oprah Winfrey was able to become as successful as she is, or why did Will Black, other than through sports. It's really, really difficult to evaluate how that happened. And for whether you're white or you're black, it's super hard to figure out exactly why that happened. There's something very often innate in the individual that allows them to overcome the barriers that exist. Right. And the really important point that I'm trying to make is not that Black individuals and households can't do it, but it's much harder because there are all these barriers that we've put in place. And so I really haven't seen studies that look at why are some successful and others not. But you're right. If we could really tease that out, then we might be onto something.
Hey, John, question in the chat. JB is asking, of all the policy solutions you mentioned, are any of them likely to actually come about? Or perhaps you could discuss which one you think is the likeliest.
Boy, in my view, a little bit unfortunately, I think it's most likely to be policy solutions that are global, rather than ones that are designed to address the issue at hand. And economists always think of those policies as being sort of second best, right? First best policies are policies that directly address the issue at hand. So I would think that baby bonds or guaranteed minimum income. I think that those are much more likely to be successful because then you get parts of the white community that say, "Oh, that's going to benefit me too." So yes, let's go ahead and do it. The other solutions, I'm skeptical. We're going the wrong way on affirmative action. Nothing is going to happen with regard to discrimination in laws. Those policies again that are global rather than specific, I think are more likely to come about. I think that none of them, frankly, are all that likely to come about. I hope that I'm wrong about that, but I'm pessimistic. Which again is part of the driving force for giving talks like this, just so that more people understand, A, that there is an issue, and B, what the sources of the issues are, and then may contemplate trying to solve it. Sean, can I talk about the difference in the Black experience compared to folks that immigrate from other countries that also experience racism and other forms of discrimination? Yeah, that's yes. It's difficult. So in the Latino community, the folks who have immigrated to the United States and they do face discrimination, there is what economists call a selection bias, right? You get people who come from Mexico or Guatemala or Honduras or wherever to the United States, who there's something about them in the same way there's something about the Oprah Winfreys who overcome barriers. And they in general find more success in the United States than do descendants of freed slaves in the United States. Because there is the selection. It's sort of the select few. And if you think about the Asian community, well, there's this whole narrative about the model immigrant, the Asian community, the model immigrant. Well, we select the immigrants from Asia as well. Based on educational attainment, based on sort of the question, what can you do for us? So there is a selection bias there as well. And I think there are very real reasons why immigrants who also face discrimination tend to have greater success in the U.S. economy than do members of the Black community. JB, thank you so much for raising The Sum of Us. The Sum of Us is an incredibly important book, incredibly important, dispiriting, I have to say, but so important. The anecdote that always sticks in my head is St. Louis, right? Before the civil rights era, the city of St. Louis had a world-class swimming pool. Whereas that swimming pool now, well, they paved the thing over in the wake of the civil rights movement because the white community didn't want to share their pool with the Black community, and after the civil rights era, they had to. And so the civil rights era is really kind of the genesis of the no tax era. Right. The no tax era has this backdrop of, don't tax me because you're going to spend that money on people who aren't like me. So I don't want you to tax me. Yeah, Some of Us, I highly recommend it. Heather McGee, not Heather McDonald. Let's see. Yeah. Yeah, it's a terrific book and a resource for doing better. Absolutely right.
And John, we have come to the end of our hour. It's true that you have a lot of resources on your website as well. Is that right?
Yep. I encourage people, if you're interested in this issue, these slides will be on my website. And if you're interested in other policy issues, we have slides and some video from all of the rest of the talks, the other 1,100 talks that NEED has given over the years. So I encourage you to go to NEED's website to have a look. If you have more questions about this, I also encourage you to reach out, toss me an email, and to the extent that I'm able, I'm very, very happy to have a conversation to continue this conversation with any of you. And again, an invitation, if you have a group who brings in speakers, I don't care if it's a cocktail party at your house. Be happy to set you up with an economist if you want to have a substantive policy conversation over cocktails at some point, a Rotary, Kiwani, what have you. Please reach out, let me know. I'd love to set you up with a speaker and a topic.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today, John. This has been very informative, and thank you, OLLI members, for joining our talk today. This has been the Black-White Wealth Gap, and this is one of our America's Unfinished Work talks. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you very much.